employer of labor, of a portion of the labor force of all the ministries that is larger than every other. And that is, I will identify them, the Ministry of Education. Can you cut education, which is critical to the development of the country? Can you cut
Thank you,
health?
Mrs. Simpson-Miller. We will now take a short break and invite you to stay tuned.
The smiles on their faces mean more than just happiness. Since 2002, the JPS Early Childhood Nutrition Program has been supporting thousands of children across the island. The program now feeds 30,000 basic school students every day. With good nourishment, they are eager and able to learn. The JPS has links to communities that go well beyond wires and poles. Here, with a little help from JPS, early childhood students are getting a chance to shine.
Now this one is called All About the Music.
Fulfilling hopes, creating dreams, and making a difference are at the heart of the Daniel Geddes Foundation. Through our Diageo Learning for Life skills training programs, over 1,800 Jamaicans now have a real chance of contributing to Jamaica's economic growth.
Upon being accepted, we learn a lot of things. Before, I thought I was just going to come and mix up some drinks and flip some bottles and stuff. But before we got to that, the meat of the matter, I learned personal development, working with colleagues and customers, communicating on the telephone instead of saying, hello, who is this?
Certified as bartenders, drapery makers, plumbers, tilers, waiters, housekeepers, customer service agents, and landscapers. Diageo Learning for Life graduates are empowered, competent, and able to give back to their families, communities, and Jamaica. The Daniel Geddes Foundation, here for Jamaicans, here for Jamaica.
It's all about the music.
The correct way to vote. Step 1. Find out exactly where you are to vote before Election Day.
Adrian Atkins.
Step 2.
Thank you very much.
Present your voter's identification card and follow the instructions of the presiding officer. Step 3. Once your identity has been verified and your name is found on the voters list, you will be issued a ballot paper. Step 4. Go behind the voting booth and mark an X with the pencil provided beside the candidate of your choice. Then, fold your ballot twice, leaving the flap out. Step 5. Give the ballot to the presiding officer. Then, dip your right index finger in the electoral ink and watch while your unopened ballot is put in the box. Step 6. Leave the vicinity in a peaceful manner.
Your vote is your voice. Make it count.
Redefine yourself. Live your dream. Walk in the steps of the leaders of the region. Be inspired. Study at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. Inspiring excellence, developing leaders.
The National Political Debates, presented by the Jamaica Debates Commission, in association with the Jamaica Public Service Company Limited, changing lives with their energy, and the D&G Foundation. Here for Jamaicans, here for Jamaica.
Welcome back to the final in the series of 3 political debates being facilitated by the Jamaica Debates Commission. If you're just joining us, welcome. We now go back to our audience to find audience member with the ticket number 12. Please step up to the microphone and pose your question to Mr. Andrew Holness.
Good evening, Mr. Holness. You stated that you have not received any complaints regarding your execution in the Ministry of Education portfolio. For the last 2 years, tertiary students have been petitioning the government for opportunities for employment and training as well as funding. Should you be elected to govern, are you prepared to provide tertiary graduates with at least 6 months on-the-job training in public institutions to assist in the employment pursuits? We've been told we have no job experience, but nobody wants to give us.
Oh, well, just to be clear, no complaints as it relates to services. Now, in terms of the program of funding tertiary education, that has been a challenged area for both administrations. In fact, the attempt to change the way in which we fund tertiary started under the previous administration. It didn't get very far because it is such a controversial and potentially explosive thing. But that is one of the things that we will have to confront with the new administration. We will have to change the way in which we fund tertiary education. As it is now, the nature of the funding limits the number of students who can access, and it also creates a problem in terms of the benefits that we can give to the students. We have, as a government, tried our best in a difficult circumstance to cut interest rates for tertiary loans, to extend the periods, and to give more grants. In fact, not many people know this, but we have increased the number of students being funded under the student loan, and we have increased the amount significantly. It is still not enough. So a fundamental change has to happen. As it relates, however, to experience, this is an issue that even I was confronted with when I left university.
Thank you, Mr. Holness. Your rebuttal, Mrs. Simpson-Miller?
We are very concerned about the number of students dropping out of the tertiary institutions because they are not able to pay the tuition fees. My administration will expand the Students' Loan Bureau and review the requirements so that more students will be able to have access to the funding of their education.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Now, Dion Jackson-Miller will pose a question to Mrs. Simpson-Miller.
Mrs. Simpson-Miller, whatever the problems with the Jamaica Development Infrastructure Program, JDIP, it's a road project which does create jobs. So doesn't your proposal then to divert some money from JDIP to fund your Jamaica Emergency Employment Program, JEEP, isn't that really just shifting jobs around rather than creating new jobs?
The JDIP program, so much funds have been wasted under the JDIP program. Take, for example, the millions of dollars being spent on one road in Cristiano. If we take 25% of the funds from JDIP, we're not going to be interfering with the budget. We're just going to be transferring funds to deal with infrastructural programs such as the cleaning of our gullies, reforestation, our riverbeds, how we deal with them, how we prevent in the event of a hurricane or a storm, that we protect property and lives. And so it is not just about spending that money carelessly. And the G program, I heard Mr. Holness referring to it as crash program. It's not a crash program. There are several elements to the JEEP that we will be able to speak to later on, perhaps in the debate when the questions arise. But certainly, we can get some money from JEEP in consultation with the Chinese, of course, and I'm sure the relationship we have with them, we would be allowed to.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Your rebuttal, Mr. Holness.
The philosophy of this new government and new governance is that employment must be generated from the private sector by investments. Investments give sustainable employment. We cannot in any way countenance any form of welfare employment. We cannot afford it at this time. That such a proposal could be made shows absolutely clearly that the opposition does not understand the dilemma in which the country finds itself. The JDIP program is already doing what you suggest in terms of fixing our rivers. Part of JDIP is river training.
Thank you, Mr. Holness. Now, Franklin McKnight will put a question to Mr. Holness.
Mr. Holness, a large part of Jamaica's population continues to live in poverty or on the edge of it. What do you see as the main cause of that situation, and what is the main thing that you would do to radically change Jamaica's prospects?
Let me put it clearly. I believe we can end poverty in Jamaica. Poverty has 3 pillars. The first is lack of education. We must continue, as administrations before this one has done, and we will do with greater intensity. We must increase access to education and make it universal. Once you lift the standard of knowledge in the society, you will create capital that will unleash the productive and creative nature of this country. You must give people access to amenities, in particular health, which is why our policy of free health care will not change. That is power to the people. The third and important pillar of poverty is income. Income means employment. And the government's new thrust now is to create an economic environment where businesses can invest. We have to make Jamaica investor friendly, and we make no apologies for that. That is the only way we're going to grow the country while managing the debt. There is no other solution to the problem, and the opposition knows this, which is why they have not presented a credible alternative. Indeed, all the international financial agencies have said to both the government and the opposition, you must pursue the program. The program
Thank
that
you,
I have
Mr. Holness. Your rebuttal, Mrs. Simpson-Miller?
I believe that job creation is critical in this country. We are in a crisis. People are starving. Women cannot send their children to school. And I believe that we need to ensure employment for our people. And my administration will be doing everything. Our manifesto speaks to our program of employment that we will embark on. At the same time, any sensitive government, any government sensitive to the needs of the people, will put an emergency program in place to provide gainful employment.
Thank
for
you,
our
Mrs.
people.
Simpson-Miller. We now go back to the audience for another question, which will be posed to Mrs. Simpson-Miller, the audience member holding ticket number 7. Please step up to the microphone and pose your question to Mrs. Simpson-Miller.
Good evening, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. How is the People's National Party different and better than the Jamaica Labour Party, since both parties have been accused of corruption, bribery, mismanagement, and such like?
The People's National Party is different because we've put in place a number of institutions to deal with corruption. I'm very strong in terms of fighting corruption and will not tolerate any form of corruption in a People's National Party government. And that's why when I'm returned to power as Prime Minister, I will ensure the strengthening of these institutions like the Office of the Contractor General and all the institutions having to investigate corruption and deal with corruption when they are reported. And I am sure if the public, members of the public, work with any government and report corruption wherever they are identified, we will be able to deal with it. I will be very firm and strong on corruption. I do not believe that we should allow anyone to corrupt the system of government. And that's why consultation is so important, and bringing people into the heart of government and governance in this country so that they will feel comfortable to communicate with their government and their leaders. Thereby, we will get more information.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Mr. Holness, your rebuttal.
I find the statement by the leader of the opposition almost incredible. On the one hand, refusing to have Trafigura aired publicly in the court, but yet saying that we are a transparent party. The difference between the Jamaica Labour Party and the People's National Party is that we are open and transparent. We stand up and face up to the errors that we make. We apologize, and we lay it on the table for the public to judge. That's a major difference in terms of how we have operated as a party and as a government.
Thank you, Mr. Holness. Dion Jackson Miller has a question now for Mr. Holness.
Mr. Holness, on page 13 of your manifesto, you promise a constitutional provision establishing core ministries and limiting the number of additional ministries. Until any such provision is in place, which could take years or decades, would you commit to reducing the size of your cabinet, and if so, by how many ministers?
Dion, I am already thinking about that. It is a difficult task. Difficult because of the things that I want to accomplish in a new government. But I've always maintained that it is not necessarily the size of the government, it is really the capacity of the ministers. And therefore, I have to look very closely on the ministers that are selected to see the capacity and the carrying load that they can manage, and then that will determine what the right size of the cabinet will be.
Thank you, Mr. Holness. Your rebuttal, Mrs. Simpson-Miller?
I don't know what transparency Mr. Holness is talking about. Because in terms of corruption, as Minister of Labor, I was the one who ensured and supported the investigation of a former Minister of Labor that went to jail as a result of corruption. And so I don't know what transparency you're talking about, because I am sure that as a Minister of Government and Prime Minister, I did everything I could to curb corruption in my government. And as a minister, my record is there. It is clear. A Minister of Government went to jail, a former minister, for corruption in Jamaica.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Mr. Franklin McKnight now has a question for Mrs. Simpson-Miller.
Mrs. Simpson-Miller, your party is resting a great deal of its economic and social programs, should it come to office, on the renegotiation of several agreements, including with the IMF, the Chinese over JDIP, and the Jamaica Public Service. How long do you believe it would take to complete those negotiations, and what would happen to the country in the interim?
I intend for it to happen between our first and second week in government. It will not take long. We have a very good relationship with, for example, China. When it was not fashionable for countries in our region to establish relationships with countries like China, we were there with China. As a matter of fact, we supported and continue to support the One China policy. I'm sure the Chinese would meet with us urgently our first week in office. And I'm sure if we call upon the public service, certainly with our shares, we will get an early meeting with the Jamaica Public Service. I don't see us having a problem dragging out what we're talking about for very long. My government will be a government of action, not talk, work.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Your rebuttal, Mr. Holness.
As the Prime Minister of the country, I'm very reluctant to renegotiate contracts. Contracts are the most certain things you can find in business and also in international relations. One has to be very careful how we make these pronouncements. They send a bad signal to investors and countries wanting to do business and have deeper relations with Jamaica. So I really am very nervous to hear the pronouncements of the People's National Party about renegotiating contracts, especially those that have to do.
Thank you, Mr. Holness. As part of the format agreed for this debate, each debater is allowed to pose one question to their opposite number. 45 seconds are allowed for the answer, followed by a 30-second rebuttal. Mrs. Simpson-Miller, please go ahead and ask your question of Mr. Holness.
Mr. Holness, the General's audit of the JDIP project was damning, one which led to the resignation of your Minister of Transport and Works, Mr. Mike Henry. As a former senior cabinet member and leader of government business, do you have the moral authority to fix a problem which you, Mr. Holness, helped to create?
That question betrays a misunderstanding of the role of the leader of government business. As a leader of government business, my role is merely to order the business of Parliament. I have no control over the ministers. And in every instance that questions were asked of JDIP to the relevant minister, the appropriate procedures were followed in Parliament, including asking the Speaker of the House to ask the House itself, the full membership, for extensions. I can take no responsibility for the not answering of questions. However, as a cabinet and as the Prime Minister,
thank you,
it is
Mr.
unquestionable
Holness,
that I have taken action
time
in
is
this
up.
matter.
Mrs. Simpson-Miller, your response, please.
Here again, Mr. Holness, you are misleading the people of Jamaica. You are neither a strong nor decisive leader. I am disappointed in you. That is why I led the walkout of Parliament. When the matter was raised in the Standing Finance Committee, you could have stopped Mike Henry. You did not. You could have stopped the corruption. You did not. You could have taken a different position from Mr. Bruce Golding.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Your time is up. Mr. Holness, it's now your turn to ask Mrs. Simpson-Miller a question.
Mrs. Simpson-Miller, the Trafigura incident happened. You weren't ready, forgive me.
I'm ready.
Okay.
The
The Trafigura question, the Trafigura matter happened just about the time of your ascendancy to leadership of the People's National Party. The funding, it is said, went to someone, ostensibly your campaign manager. Did you benefit, and did your ascendancy to the presidency of the People's National Party benefit from the Trafigura funds?
Ascendancy of the People's National Party, I don't know what you're talking about. Ascendancy, because we lost that election. So how could we ascend if we lost the election? My ascendancy to the presidency of the People's National Party. Yes, we got a contribution from Trafigura, I was told. And when the matter was raised, I gave instructions immediately that the money should be sent back to Trafigura. And my trusted leaders in the party indicated to me that my instructions were carried out.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Mr. Holness, your response?
You consistently say that the Trafigura matter is merely a political contribution, and that it may be. The only challenge is that it is a political contribution from a foreign company. And whilst in Jamaica, the matter may not be illegal, it is illegal in another jurisdiction for which we have certain obligations and relations. And we would have to facilitate that jurisdiction in investigating locally.
Thank you. We now go to closing statements. Mrs. Portia Simpson-Miller of the People's National Party will go first, based on the earlier coin toss decision. Mrs. Simpson-Miller.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, amidst all that has been said here tonight, our country remains in crisis. The economy continues to shrink. Unemployment is increasing. It is now up to 12.3%. Poverty has doubled. Hopelessness is increasing under this government. Our only option as a people is to unite and work together to grow the economy. When we form the next government, our priorities will include the expansion of educational opportunities at all levels, the financing of a national export strategy, placing a special focus on SMEs, negotiating an extended fund facility with the IMF, and focusing on non-traditional sectors such as ICTs and the creative and cultural industries. This is not the time for a government that requires a learning curve. To address the crisis we all face, this country must choose an experienced and accomplished leader, the best team to rescue Jamaica and to restore the hope. A leader and a team that you can trust. A leader and a team with a heart, a team that will put Jamaica and Jamaicans at the heart and the center of governance and government. A team that will balance the books while we balance people's lives. We have done it before, we will do it again. And I want to say that we believe in consultation and we will be in constant dialogue with the population.
Thank you, Mrs. Simpson-Miller. Mr. Andrew Holness of the Jamaica Labour Party will now make his closing statement for tonight's debate. Mr.
Recently,
Holness?
I was speaking to some university students, and the conversation made me realize that an entire generation of Jamaicans have grown up only knowing depressed social and economic environment. The political process has not so far inspired and in some cases frustrated to the point where our young people almost expect that poverty is a permanent part of our society, that our roads will always have potholes, that only some children will get quality education, only the rich will get justice, interest rate, crime, unemployment, electricity, and our debt will remain high, corruption will reign, and our leaders can't or won't do anything about it. I'm part of that generation, and I understand the frustration because deep inside each and every one of us is that seed of hope that Jamaica can do well. When Usain Bolt and other athletes brought home gold from the Olympics, it lifted our spirits and we all wanted to share in that accomplishment. I have seen glimmers of hope in our economy and society. Murders have declined significantly. Interest rates are down to single digits. Action is being taken to stamp out corruption. More children than ever before are getting access to quality education and health care. And now that we have stability in our economy, the glimmers of hope can be turned into the flame of prosperity for all. I believe we can do it. I believe we can end poverty. I believe we can have universal education. I believe we can have a world-class infrastructure. I believe we can have a disciplined, loving, and caring society. I believe in Jamaica. I believe in you. I ask for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Holness. That concludes the final of 3 debates. Our debaters tonight were Mrs. Portia Simpson-Miller of the People's National Party and Mr. Andrew Holness of the Jamaica Labour Party. In the spirit of the debates, we'll now ask our debaters to greet each other. A special thanks to the University of the West Indies Mona campus, the Mona School of Business, the UWI Faculty of Law, and the UWI Marketing and Communications Office for hosting us this evening. On behalf of our production team, funding partners, and the Jamaica Debates Commission, I'm Dervan Malcolm. Good evening.